Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Meanahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey now, folks, my name is Nick, and today we are going to take a look at Fief France 1429 from Academy Games. This is actually a quick review of Fief, and if you're not familiar with that, I did another one of these earlier in the week for Three Kingdoms Redux from Starting Player Games. And for Three Kingdoms Redux, I did it because the overview of that game would have been immense, and I think it would have been the same with Fief as well. So that's one reason why there's no legit overview for this video. The other reason in particular for Fief is that I no longer own a copy of the game. I played it a few times and then it was on its way out, which I suppose is going to tell you a lot about what I feel about the game and is a bit of a spoiler, but I thought I would just be honest and upfront. Try to act surprised when you get to my final thoughts. But I did play it enough that I wanted to share my final thoughts with you, and I'll tell you a little bit about how the game is played, kind of go through it and what the theme of the game is, and flash some images of what the components look like, and then we'll take it from there with my final thoughts. So in Fief France 1429, you and the other players take control of warring families during that period in French history. You are trying to gain power. Now, how you gain power in this game is either by taking control of fiefdoms, hence the name of the game, but also, and I'm not going to say this word properly, bishoprics, areas of influence for the bishops of France. On the game board, these are going to be delineated by different lines. So you have fiefs, you have bishoprics. That sounds rough. Doesn't sound right in my head. And you also have the villages that you'll gain control of as well. Each player is going to start off in a different area of the map, and then you're going to have troops. You're going to be able to recruit more troops. You'll get soldiers and knights. And there was an expansion that I didn't play with that has even more types of troops. And then you can actually build things. You can build windmills, which are going to get you money because you start to produce grain, and you're going to have different types of fortresses. There's a full Fief tower thing that actually gets you one of the few victory points that you need in the game. And that is how you win the game. But unlike in so many other Euro games where you get a ton of different points, like a point salad game, in this game, 3 points. That's all you need to win the game is 3 points. And you can get that in a variety of different ways, by getting a high enough title, which I'll get back to in a second, by claiming enough fiefdoms, and so on. You can get those precious, precious points, which are going to enable you to win. Now, it's also possible during the course of the game that you can make an alliance with one other player, and only one other player. If that's the case, the two of you combined only need 4 victory points in order to win. But like I said, even though it's a very low amount of points, getting those is easier said than done. Now, I alluded to titles just a second ago, and a big part of this game, both the theme of the game and the mechanisms of the game, they're kind of really tightly interwound in this particular area and facet of it, is that you can actually level up. You can become, get a better title and raise your station in the world. So you're just a sort of a lower duke or noble at the start of the game, but you can raise up to be even king at a certain point if you go that route. You could perhaps go for dominance of the bishoprics instead, and you could even become pope. You could go bishop, you can go to pope. There's a lot of different titles in this game, and how all of that is going to work is with a different subsystem of the game, of voting, of nominating one of the different nobles that you have under your control. You'll gain these different character cards during the course of the game with their own standees and things like that, and then you can actually nominate them in order to gain these different titles and have them under your control. And this eventually is another way that you can get the precious victory points that you need to win. So as you can tell, there is a lot going on in the game. There's a dice combat system based on the number of troops that you have, so you can you're definitely going to engage in combat at some point. The way that you build alliances with other players is actually through marriage. If you've got, and you know, this is before the time of legalized gay marriage, unfortunately, but if you have a female character and a male character, you and another player can wed them. You actually have a ring card in the game, or it's either a card or a token, and then you are able to be in that alliance together and hopefully win. But remember, you need an extra point in order to do that if you're in an alliance, or else the other players can try and go for the solo win. You can't win solo if you've already engaged in an alliance with another player. So there is a ton of stuff going on in this game, if you couldn't tell. A lot of different systems, things I didn't even mention, but that's the meat of the game. It is a game of area control, of conquest, of alliances, diplomacy, just trying your best to raise your little corner of empire of the of France in that time period in 1429 and gain titles and just be the best darn Frenchman that you can possibly be. Okay, in all seriousness, let's talk about this quite a bit. Let's talk about the components first and foremost. I actually think it's a good-looking game. Now, the board is very busy. A lot of that has to do with the fact that you have these different delineated lines for both the fiefdoms and for the villages and for the bishoprics, and it just looks kind of confusing at first, but I still think it looks pretty good. And the tokens all look kind of cool. I mean, it's a nice presentation. Now, I didn't even have the really nice version. I saw someone else's copy that had the plastic towers and just all the little plastic bits, and those look really cool. So if you're lucky enough to get those, you know, I would go for them. I don't know if they were an exclusive for Kickstarter or if you can buy them separately, but whatever the case might be. But I think the game looks pretty good in either case. There's a ton of stuff in the game which goes towards the fiddliness, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it still looks good. As far as the theme goes, definitely the strongest part of Fief by far. I have played a lot of different games that fall into the area control, conquest, strategic maneuvering type genre. I don't know what the full type of genre would be for that. I don't know. I think that a lot of war gamers like Fief, but I don't know that you would call this a war game. No, definitely not. But it's a game, I would say it's actually unique in the way that it has all these different things put together. But the best part about it is by far the theme, because I love the idea that it's not just, here's my army, and I'm going to go trouncing off, and I'm going to destroy you, and that's that, and I'll just get lucky and get a bunch of dice, and that's that. No, there's the title system, and being able to raise through those ranks, and then being able to build alliances with other people, and you do it through marriage. That's like, I don't know, cool. Like, it's not like a huge deal, but it felt very thematic to me, and it felt cool, and that's what I wanted to do throughout the course of the game. I would have been perfectly happy just to be being diplomatic with the other players and trying to go through the voting system and even nominate the people that I have under my control in order to gain these ranks would have been really, really cool. But it's not quite that simple. It is a very complex process in the game, which I felt hurt the game pretty badly, because there are these cool thematic elements, and getting to them is kind of pulling teeth. And that's where I'm at with this game, because while those parts of the game are cool, the actually sitting down and playing it from turn to turn is very, very boring. It's, you know, I want to say that it raises above the, while you can do these other things to gain victory points, to gain status in the game, and to do well, at the end of it all, you still need to do the raising up your army, building stuff, and then trouncing into other people's territory and trying to take their stuff, and none of that is done very well at all. It feels very, it just feels very boring. It feels like the same as every other game. Get a bunch of dice, roll a bunch of dice. Oh, look, I won, you guys are gone, and maybe I get to capture your person. That's neat. But that area of the game is pretty random, whereas the rest of the game is kind of deterministic as to how you build things. But even then, that's pretty dull. You don't have a lot of different buildings that you can choose if you don't have the expansion. And I found that there's no reason not to build windmills, and just keep building windmills, and build as many windmills as you can until all the windmills are gone. That is what you should do, absolutely by far, and everyone ends up doing that in the beginning. Just hunker down, get your resource engine going as quickly as possible, and then just build up dudes, and maybe you'll get lucky and take out the other guys. Unless you purposely go out of the box and try to do other things, like building alliances with other players. And really, while I think that's a very cool thematic element, I don't like that you're pretty much railroaded into that. I mean, two players can make an alliance and not officially wed each other and just go off and hot dog it and team up temporarily against another couple of other players, but really, if you want to do well in the game, building an alliance makes sense. You only I know that victory points are sparse in the game, but you only need one more in order to do that. So it feels like, why wouldn't I do that? And I think the biggest problem is just that there's all these different things going on, and it just doesn't manage to be as exciting as you would think that it would be. Now, someone that I played the game with pointed out that they thought that it felt like a game from the 80s. And I actually went ahead and said, well, That's because it is. This actually was a reprint of a much older game from like 1980, I don't know, 3, something like that. And then that person was like, oh, totally explains it. And I was not lucky or unlucky to play games back in that time period. I was just a youngin' back in the early 80s. But I get what they were saying, because this is before games sort of got refined, and they just threw as much stuff as they possibly could into the box because people could sit around and play for, hours and hours and hours and hours and hours at a time. And that's another thing about this game. It's very, very long. If you really sit down there and try to play the full game, especially with the more players that you have, I think this game can go up to quite a few players, like 5 or 6 players. Maybe you need the expansion. But I don't know. It felt tedious at times. It felt like all the cool things I wanted to do as far as the ranks just felt like a chore to get through. It felt like there were obvious things that you needed to do in order to do well in the game. And while I could definitely see people enjoying the theme so much that they kind of ignore all those other trappings, and I'm sure there's people yelling at their monitor saying, you don't have to play that way, you can have fun, and you can really get into the theme. But to me, there needs to be solid mechanisms to back it up, and this just felt like an older, unpolished game that I'm sure a lot of people were clamoring for. The game is doing very well, I'm sure. But for me, I've just moved on from this type of game, even though I never had to sit through playing these types of games back in the 80s. I just feel that right now, there's so many other better options if you want that sort of fun territory control, fighting other people. But hey, if you do like the theme a lot and you're willing to put the time into it, you might dig it. For me, it was a pass, obviously, since I've traded it away. That is Fief France 1429 from Academy Games.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.